They say we should have known better than to fall so deep down into this rabbit hole we found. And I was thinking,
hi, this is Nico. You're listening to my Dad Fall, also known as the White Rabbit, and James Jardine on the one and only Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. Buckle up and enjoy.
deep into this pool of regrettable situations. Pitch black, think back to the last time that we were happy.
Alrighty, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome down to Security Rabbit Hole to another edition of the Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. This is Raph. I've got James sitting over that way. Hey, bud.
Sitting some way, right?
He's sitting somewhere.
We never have all the same views, so it's like you
That's true.
point, like nobody. I don't know what you're pointing to, but I'm here.
We equipment troubles with the Mac be damned. We figured it out. This has been a challenge since the latest update on the MacBooks.
Yeah.
You're kind of seeing it more than anybody else, my friend. So I don't.
I know.
I don't know
my
what to make of
solution
that.
is I'm on a Windows device.
Yeah, there's some irony there.
Yeah.
Well, so today's episode, I wanted to bring up a topic that I've heard. I'm not sure I fully understand both the space or the need. So I invited Head Kovetz to join us. He's from Silverfort. I'm going to let you talk a little bit about yourself and give us a little bit of history, sir.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. Great to be here. So my name is Head. I'm the CEO and one of the founders at Silverfort. Silverfort is a company in identity security, so I'm happy to share a bit more about that. Founded it about 8 years ago. Before that, I was a product manager in the cybersecurity industry. I worked a bit for some governments, building the national cybersecurity infrastructure, and before that, also did some work in the 8200 unit, so cyber offense, basically. Yeah. For about 6 years, and great to be here today and talk a bit about identity security.
All right, so let's start with the burning question. I took a random poll of folks that I talk to on a daily basis, and some friends said, "Hey, can you tell me what identity security is?" And I got the usual suspects, the ones that you think about when you think SSO, you think logins, but nobody really could give me a solid definition of identity security, although it seems like it's a no-brainer. Talk to me about this space. Give me a definition, a market definition, perhaps.
So I think that what you're probably referring to when you ask people and hear those usual suspects is probably what we call identity and access management, right? Companies
Yes.
like
Yes.
Okta and Ping and others. And what they do is they manage your identities, meaning they have the actual usernames and you onboard users to them and you offboard users and they manage those identities and they authenticate and give access for applications like single sign-on, as you said. And what identity security is the goal of preventing any of these identities and credentials from being abused, right? From anyone from taking over them, using them to do bad things, using them to take over a network, which I think for a long time you just assumed is part of the job of these identity and access management solutions.
That's
right?
exactly what I thought. Right?
Yeah, I know.
That's where my head went. My brain said, "Well, don't those people shouldn't they be doing that job?"
I know. And that's what a lot of people thought for many, many years. And I think some people obviously still think that, but I think that something is changing in the world. And I think the reason that it's changing is because so many data breaches just compromise these types of identity and access management solutions. So it's surprisingly easy to take over identities today, which means that something is missing.
Right.
And I think it's very similar to what happened to other categories of security that started as a feature in the infrastructure and became their own thing. Think about cloud security. People used to say, why do you need that? I can get that from AWS and from Azure. And then, came cloud security solutions like Wiz and others, and said, no, you need to do this properly across the board with focus on security, not as a feature, because of two reasons. One, it's an expertise. Like security is an expertise. It's not a feature.
Right.
And second of all, because identities exist in many places. You got one identity in Okta, you got one in Google, you got one on-prem in your Active Directory. If you would look for these vendors to secure them, this is like buying endpoint security from Lenovo and Apple and Dell, individually. You need someone that has a security focus that can look at all these islands. It's true for endpoints, as I just said. It's true for cloud, where you want a solution that protects all the different clouds, even though those vendors could do that locally, but in a silo. And you need the same for identity, because yes, Okta could secure identities in their own island, but can they also understand what's going on in Entra and Active Directory and Ping and all these other silos? That's where you need a security vendor that can see across the board.
Is it a misnomer then to think, because I think traditionally, Raf, we look at those companies as security companies.
Yeah.
If you're talking to somebody, IGA, PAM, all that stuff, right? We look at that as that's a security feature. Security typically owns it.
Yep.
They're the ones to implement it. But at the same time, if you're comparing it to like an AWS or an Azure or something, like, okay, it's providing infrastructure type services with some sprinkled in secure features. Is it wrong to look at them and say, like, hey, those are security functions, but no, they're identity management, and we need to split identity management and identity security into two separate functions?
I think that, yes, it's time to do that, because the result is just there's a lot of data breaches taking advantage of stolen identities. So obviously, somebody needs to do that better, I guess. And it's not because these companies that I mentioned are not good companies. They're great companies. It's just that security is only part of their job. A lot of their job is, productivity, and it's an IT infrastructure kind of offering. Security is part of that, but we see how often these solutions get breached, and we understand that it's time for security to decouple from identity management. Now, some of the things you mentioned, like PAM, right, and there's a lot of other categories we can talk about, are already there, right? So some vendors are already doing identity security. It just was never called identity security, but they're already doing privileged access management or multi-factor authentication or identity threat detection and response. There's already a lot of these solutions out there, but nobody has yet consolidated them as one thing called identity security, which again is similar to how other categories have matured, right? Before there were cloud identity solutions, there were a bunch of, there was one product for container security and one for cloud entitlements. And then at some point, people said, okay, there's enough of these small solutions to create a category called cloud security. I think identity is going through the same thing now. By the way, I think that the reason why identity is only now going through that is because identity in the recent years have become a bit more important, as people are just working from anywhere and are using any device, right? I can log in from, a cafe in Thailand and from a device that is not even a company device. So network security and endpoint security are not necessarily doing the same job anymore. And as long as I can prove that it's me, I'm part of your virtual environment, whether you want it or not. So identity became a bit more crucial. I think that's why it's going through that same evolution that endpoint security and network security and cloud security already went to. But it's an evolution. It takes time.
I want to push back just a little bit, because I understand, and it makes complete sense that when you talk about all these different islands and like looking at it on the horizontal, not the vertical, right? I get that. The part that really, I don't know, maybe just because I've been in this industry so long, that we get this cycle of product space tends to fracture on the use cases, and at some point it consolidates.
Yes.
And then innovation slows down, and we get little itty bitty, and then it adds to that consolidation, and the amoeba gets bigger. I can't help but think that every time there's a new sub market, it means the security budget has to go up because you have to buy more stuff. You need more people and expertise, right? Because they're not already there. And more things to integrate, which means potentially more things to screw up and more complexity. Why not build some of these features into like a Ping or an Okta? And because they do have some pretty broad range, why not build it that way? Because I 100% see your point, why you did it the way you did it. This is just more of a general frustration, and I think with the way the industry is built, is we have all these little micro tools, right? And you need security for Azure endpoints, you need security for this, you need security for the way Amazon does this one thing over here, and the one way Google does it over here. As a CISO, so as a CISO, it's got to be frustrating.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I tell you what I think happened here and why I do think that this makes sense, but I think that the history of this is helping at least me to understand this. So, a long time ago, we only had one identity infrastructure solution. We had our Active Directory on-prem or whatever whatever we had, but it was probably one or two. So trying to secure them, not that it was done very properly, but trying to secure them was you could argue that it needs to be done by the infrastructure provider, okay? Because you had one identity solution, maybe two. I think that what happened over the years is people started having many identity solutions. A lot of people today have Okta and Entra, and they just acquired a company, then those guys use Ping, and they also have their old AD on-prem, maybe multiple forests, and they still have an old, some even older solution there. So what happened is people actually said the opposite of what I think you're saying, because they said, I'm actually paying 5 times for the same product. So cost and complexity was actually getting worse to the point where even the basic stuff, like multi-factor authentication, I need to now have 3 different MFA solutions. I log into Entra with my Microsoft Authenticator, and then I log into this old on-prem server. I still use my RSA token. And people started saying, why am I paying for the same features here and here? It's also bad user experience, and it's very complex to maintain all these things. And then they said, you know what? Okay. We actually got to the point where having identity security as a unified platform will actually reduce the complexity. So it's an evolution that took years to happen, but I think that it actually relates to your point.
Does identity security contain identity management? Or are you still looking at, I still have to have those other solutions from a management standpoint, but then I need an additional solution for the security portion? Is that accurate?
Great question. So I think that you do need still identity infrastructure and you need identity security, but the good news is you will no longer need to get those security features from each of the identity infrastructure providers. So you'll still have your Active Directory and your Okta, and all these different identity infrastructure solutions, but security you'll just get from one place. You won't need to get them from each of them individually. So it is lowering cost and complexity. But
I still have to have my Ping, my Okta, my whatever through all these acquisitions. I just now need an additional tool on top of all those.
Yes, but you only need them for identity management. You will not need to get the different security features from each of them. When you think about this and compare this to other categories of security, it actually makes more sense because you understand the similarities, right? Again, in cloud, you have cloud infrastructure. You also have dedicated cloud security. Why? Because you don't want to buy that separately from each of them. You want someone who's just doing it end to end. Same for endpoint. You don't buy that from the laptop providers. You buy it from an endpoint protection company. They can run on all the endpoints. So the same is happening with identity, and although it's counterintuitive, I think the more you spend time on it, you understand that this is actually a way to reduce complexity, reduce number of vendors, reduce cost. What I think happened that for a while made it worse, and I think that's a natural thing, is for a while people understood what I'm just saying, but they just went and created all these standalone, subcategories of identity security. like identity threat detection and response, right? ITDR, or non-human identity security, NHI, that's now a new thing. And obviously privileged access management. And so there was all these things that made it worse. You're right. So at that point, yes, I needed all these infrastructure products and I needed 10 different identity security products, which I think is the natural evolution of a market. That's okay because the vendors are small in the beginning. It's mostly startups. And what's happening now is the second phase of that maturity where companies like us and also others are trying to consolidate identity security. I think when we finish doing that, the market will be better than it was before. Because yes, we'll have some infrastructure solutions still, but security will not be a local feature in each of them. We will not need to buy it and use it in each of them. We'll just buy it from one vendor, just like we buy cloud security or network security or endpoint security. I think at that point it will make sense. I think we're close to it, but it's an evolution.
But does identity security work without a solution like that? Like if I just have, AD, I've got some other things. I don't have anything centrally managing my identities, but I've got a bunch of sources for identities. Yeah. Do I still need to have the, management of it, right? Like we use Okta as an example, like an Okta to kind of bring it all together. But we're really saying, okay, we need that, but we don't need the security features, right? Like, because we don't want the security of AWS, GCP, and Azure all there. So my real question is, if we need that, like the management feature, does that make it more difficult to sell the management feature if it's no longer a security feature? Because I feel like it changes that a little bit.
So I think that you still need identity management because you have different environments. That's not because you like having many vendors. It's because you have on-prem and you have maybe a couple of cloud environments. And whether you like it or not, each of them has different identity management. And that's probably going to stay there unless someone else solves it, which is not me, and solves the infrastructure issue and unifies it, right? But I think that when it comes to security, there is a way to do it already. So the fact that the infrastructure is fragmented doesn't mean that security has to be. I think that although our infrastructure is partially on-prem, partially in the cloud, maybe also more than one cloud, I think that we are at the point where we can at least solve the unification of security across all these silos. Okay, maybe one day we'll also not have multiple environments and we'll solve that too, but I think that security has to be solved faster because it's a problem. People are getting breached because they're not looking at all these islands together, I'll give you an example. If somebody is logging into Okta and they fail the authentication, they fail the multi-factor authentication, it's not them. They can still log into Entra, they can still log into Google, they can still log in on-prem. So the fact that we are looking at security as a silo in each of them means that we're not getting effective security. It's only looking at that one island, only securing that one island. Almost every big data breach we've seen in recent years was trying to get to all of these places. So you can't just lock the door and leave the window open. You need to look at it holistically, just like any other element of security.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense now. So when you're talking about identity security, give me the core feature set then of this marketplace, this market space rather. What are we talking about?
So it's still shaping, and I can tell you my opinion, right? And I think some people have different opinions. That's the fun part about the market, that is still shaping. Anyone can claim that it's what they think it is. And it is, as you said, it is a new thing. It is still being, formed. But I think that there are some things that are pretty clear. So there are some elements that have been there for a long time, right? Multi-factor authentication, privileged access management, entitlements, right? What are you allowed to access? Which, by the way, people might argue, is that part of the identity management? Is that part of security? I think there's good arguments for both sides. There's also some new categories, like ITDR, identity threat detection and response. That's a new thing. Didn't exist a few years ago. I mean, you had endpoint detection and response, right? And you had other elements of it, but identity was neglected. Now there's ITDR trying to do the same, look at compromised accounts and detect lateral movement and try to detect those threats. There's another new category, which sounds very similar to ITDR. It's a little different, called ISPM, Identity Security Posture Management. The difference is, I know. I need to go slowly. You know, it's a lot of new buzzword that the market needs to learn. I'll tell you what the difference is, and maybe you'll see that it makes sense to have both. But although, again, people can argue that all of these need to consolidate. If ITDR, which is about detection of threats, means that you're getting attacked right now, and I want to find that and alert on it and stop it, identity security posture management is not about you getting breached right now. It's about you having exposures to potential breaches, like you're using legacy protocols, or you have people that have shared accounts, or inactive accounts, or all kinds of things that are hygiene issues. They're exposure issues. They're not about actual attacks. The reason why this is split is because it has a different user in the company, right? One is more the SOC team. They need to understand what's going on right now. They don't care that you're still using a legacy protocol somewhere that's not an actual incident. And then there's the IAM team that needs to solve the actual exposures, the bad configurations. So these are two new things. Another new category or subcategory, right? I don't think all of these need to be categories, but another subcategory is non-human identity security.
Yeah.
That's a very important one, I think. I think that was overlooked for many years. And we did a lot to secure our human identities with multi-factor authentication and lots of monitoring. And then attackers simply went and grabbed some service accounts that has a lot of privileges, and nobody's looking at that, and nobody can protect that, and it can't do multi-factor authentication, because it doesn't have a thumbs.
Right.
And they just took over it and breached the network, which happened in many of the data breaches of the recent years. We've seen a data breach just recently on one of our customers where an attacker was already in the network. Somebody clicked the wrong thing, and they were on their computer, and they easily found a privileged service account and started to try to spread in the network. Normally, you wouldn't be able to even know that it's happening, because, some people say that you should rotate the passwords of these accounts once every couple of months, but first of all, that's still plenty of time for someone to use them, and also, try to do that for 10,000 service accounts, and you'll end up breaking your entire network, right?
Yeah.
So it's not easy to do. So that whole new category is about how do we understand what these non-human identities are doing, secure them, make sure nobody can abuse them. I think it's important. So these are some examples of the categories that exist within identity security. I think that if they were all standalone, then you would be right. That's too much for a CISO to handle. So that's why we have to unify them into one thing.
Can I ask you a philosophical question?
Of course.
Where does identity, the concept of identity, delegation, management, privilege access, duty segregation, detection and response, where does that belong? Is that a CISO thing? Because that has gone back and forth. Right? It's a hot potato that's been tossed around back and forth, back and forth.
That's a great question. I think that there's a lot of people thinking about this. I'm talking to a lot of customers about this. Where does it sit? Is it infrastructure? Is it security? Who does it report to? And people move it around. I think they used to not want it. Now some of them actually want to own it. It's because it's a pain. But now I think people understand it's important. I think that the fact that it's so unclear actually proves my point that it has to separate. Right?
Yeah.
Identity infrastructure, managing your directories and your IDPs, that needs to sit with infrastructure. And identity security needs to sit with the CISO, just like in any other category. Just like the CISO doesn't, he owns, or he or she owns endpoint security, but not the endpoints themselves. That's the IT team.
That's fair.
I think that the reason why identity is so confusing in terms of where it's sitting is because we mix two things together. So yes, it's unclear where they should sit because it's two things mixed together.
Shouldn't some of that come down to who's doing the work? Whose area is that? Like I look at IAM, right? If you didn't have an IAM program, who's managing identities? It's not the security team.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's the infrastructure, it's the AD, but whoever, right? It's some other group that's doing that. But then you say, oh, well, we need identity management. And now all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, that's a security feature. And I think to your point, right, because we mixed the two in and we said, hey, look, IAM is going to be security. We look at it as a security function. Then we want it to be that. But in the most part, it's not high-end security. It's grouping together. So I have visuals, almost like the posture management piece. I have a view of what's going on. But still in the day-to-day, is it security that's still going in and managing the identities and policies? And like security helps set policies, but are they the ones hands-on actually implementing policy? Like that should be that separation. I like to look at it from that, like who's actually going to be using it? To me is more of like who should own it. And then if you want somebody else that say, hey, look, security has oversight to make sure that we are using it like we're supposed to be using it, that makes sense.
I think that if you had an identity infrastructure solution, like your AD, your Okta, and you had your identity security solution, then it would be clear, right? Like who needs to do the work on each. And I think that obviously they will need to collaborate, but I think that the fact that it's mixed makes it very confusing. I'll give you an example. I was talking with a lot of CISOs, in the last years about this, and a lot of them said, I didn't want to own identity for many years because it's such a pain. It's kind of the, if it goes down for even a minute, everybody loses their mind. I don't want to own it. It's so sensitive and it's so complex. But I realized over time that it's my biggest vulnerability. It's my biggest blind spot. I need to own it because otherwise, what am I doing? I mean, attackers are going to come in through the identity every time, and it's my job. So I said, I want to own it, but I don't want to take all of that infrastructure piece with it. I don't want to own Active Directory now. I somehow want to, have them take care of Active Directory and like the infrastructure and running those domain controllers and and doing all the cloud IDPs, but I want to somehow only take the security part out. And I think that if that was the case, which is where I think it's going, I think that would have been clear. Then the identity team, the identity infrastructure team is in charge of the infrastructure, onboarding users and so on, but also just the infrastructure itself, like the domain controllers, right, is an easy example in the on-prem world, but just the systems themselves that manage the identities. And the security team is the one that need to look at the alerts, build the security policies, apply the security controls. If they could do that from their own tool without having to own AD and Okta, that would be a much better, allocation of the responsibilities. And that's where I think it's moving. That's where we also believe that it should go. And I think that we are not the only ones also. I'm hearing more and more companies where this is what's happening. They're actually moving, identity into security, but the directory team still owns AD under IT.
So let me kind of take this maybe a little bit more technical. When you're thinking about designing a product in your space, you're pulling data from the way identity interacts with everything. Is there enough data being generated, right? Because I want to think about like in a web request, right? When you're making web requests, HTTP requests, that data is passed along. But when I'm logged into, I don't know, picking a desktop app, and are we putting like basically getting debug information at that level, right? Like how do you getting that data and what are you getting?
That's a really good point. So now that we are on this journey to figure out identity security, it brings us to all of these questions of how do we get all the relevant data? How do we plug into all the silos of identity? Some of them are very complex. In the cloud, as you said, I have a lot of information. I can go into, Entra or even SaaS applications. I can get a lot of data pretty easily. Right. Think about Active Directory or legacy things on-prem. We have customers that use our product to protect even OT systems and command line interfaces and mainframe, right? Think about that. Like that took a longer time to figure out, because I think that part of unifying identity security to me is not only unifying all these subcategories like PAM and MFA and ITDR. It was also how do we unify all the resources, all the environments? How do we do it all the way from the SaaS applications to the most legacy things? And there, you're right, you have a different level of information, but you still have a lot of information. Even if you look at protocols like LDAP and Kerberos and NTLM and Radius, some of these things that are being used on-prem, there's still a lot there. Like I can still know which user is trying to log into which resource, from which, from where. I can understand a lot of things that relate to the behavior. I can understand things that relate to the protocol itself. Did someone try to lower the encryption? Is somebody trying to use an account that has all kind of shadow admin privileges that I can find by looking at the directory? Is someone trying to do lateral movement? Is someone trying to move from this endpoint to that endpoint, and then I see another privileged account moving from that endpoint to another endpoint? There's a lot that you can see by looking at all the access, even in the legacy protocols. It was much harder to do, and there are much fewer vendors doing it. So I think it's actually a very important thing as a vendor to invest in it. But that is what really helps companies to know that we can really see that thing end to end.
All right, I think since we're about out of time, I want to save some of this for a follow-up, because this is a topic that I think we can probably expand on a little bit. I appreciate the overview. The market. I'm always a skeptic when it comes to putting a new market in front of me, because some of the time it's just an analyst that's like, okay, I need to go do, find some new market. But I think in this case, legitimately, you've got a pretty good case for creating a new horizontal to unify the various islands of identity, even if they do some of their own security at that infrastructure level. When you've got, was it ITR, identity threat
ITDR.
detection, ITDR? Yeah. Maybe I want to talk about that a little bit next time too, because that starts to get interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting, and I think that it's definitely a very dynamic market right now. There's a lot happening, and as you say, the analysts want to say, their perspective, and the vendors have their perspective, and obviously the customers have, their needs. What do they actually need us to solve? And it's actually pretty exciting because it's all happening, and there's a chance to influence it.
Yeah.
So I think that it's definitely happening, though. That I can tell you. There's enough vendors and analysts and customers that are actually buying it. We obviously have a lot of traction with, many organizations that need this product. So I think there's something definitely happening, and now it's time to figure out together what it is. I think it's an exciting time.
Well, that's cool. Well, thanks for taking some time to explore this with me. I know that it's probably gets a little daunting to have to go to explain to people like, all right, here's the 9,000th time of what this market is, but I appreciate it because I think it sheds some light on something that I was fairly unclear on. I know a lot of people I talked to had no idea, so that makes sense. So I want to wish you luck and continued success, but we're going to have you back. I want to kind of dive deeper into some of these subcategories that you were talking about, because they sound exciting.
I'd love to tell you more about that. Also, I think that there's a lot to be said about not only the subcategories of identity security, but also how do you bring identity security everywhere? We talked about cloud, on-prem, legacy. There's so many places that were complete blind spots until now, and attackers used to go to every time. You would protect your web application. They would just use a remote PowerShell to log into the server, try to do MFA for that, right? And we actually found a way, right? So that's a lot. There's a lot of discussion also to be had around those things that have been blind spots for many years.
All right. Well, good. We got plenty of stuff to talk about next time then.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. Head from Silverfort. Good to have you aboard. James, thanks for playing along. This is so many good questions. I think I've got more questions than we got answered, but let's write some of these down and do them again next time.
Thank you.
Lots of room for follow-up.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Really enjoyed it, and see you next time.
We'll do it next time. Thanks for listening, you guys. This has been another episode of the Down to Security Rabbit Hole podcast on identity security. We're going to do this again because there is more to be said. So stand by, listen in, and we'll